Hello everyone and welcome to this second episode of the short series Staging Ancient Greek Tragedy Then and Now, hosted here at UCL in occasion of UCL's annual classical play, which this year will be Euripides Electra, running at the Bloomsbury Theatre in London from the 9th to the 11th of February. And you can find more information about tickets and our study guide, etc. on our website, UCL.UK. I am joined today by the director and assistant director to this year's play, Zoe Morris and Lucy Rudman, and Zoe Harris-Wallace, who is doing costumes for the play. Who will be interviewing our two special guests on this week's episode on set, props and costumes then and now. Dr. Rosie Wells, senior lecturer in classical history and literature at the University of Kent, and Dr. Michael Loy, assistant director of the British School of Athens. So over to you, Zoe, and welcome Rosie and Michael, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you. So the first question is just to sort of paint a scene of Electra, really. So we'd like to ask you, Electra is set in Argos and its surrounding area. Could you possibly tell us some more about ancient Argos as a place, especially for those who haven't been to Greece? Where is it? What is its physical geography and climate like? And how do you think these might have had any bearing on how one should interpret or imagine the set?
Well, so Argos is in the Argolid region of Greece, which is just over and round to the west of Athens, in the Peloponnese, in the northeast Peloponnese. The Argolid is a fairly dry region. It's one of the driest regions in Greece, actually. When Homer's talking about the Argolid region, he talks about it being very thirsty. The area of Argos, the city, it's right in the middle of a large plain, surrounded by mountains on the other sides. We don't know an awful lot about classical Argos itself, so the Argos that would have been standing round about the time that Euripides was writing. That's because there's a modern city right on top of where the ancient city would have been, and there have only been sort of little bits of exploration around throughout the city. We can infer little bits about what the city might have looked like. There are some city walls that were put up in the medieval period, which possibly follow the route of the ancient classical city walls. But by and large, we don't know a lot about classical Argos. Prehistoric Argos, on the other hand, we do know little bits about. In this whole Argolid region, there are a number of hilltop settlements in the prehistoric period, in the Bronze Age. So Argos was one of these settlements. There was a settlement on top of a hill called Aspis, but then there were also other hilltop settlements that you might have heard of. So the settlement at Mycenae, the settlement at Tiryns. Of course, Mycenae is a place that features within Euripides' Electra play. So these places, they were naturally fortified on top of hills, but then throughout the Bronze Age, they were also fortified even further as well, with fantastic fortification walls put up around these settlements on top of the hills. The walls at Mycenae get called the Cyclopean walls, because the bricks, the stones that are used to build these walls are so massive that people think that they could have only been put up by the Cyclopes. So, you know, one thing to bear in mind about this local geography and how it's relevant for Euripides' play is that, you know, think of these hilltop settlements, think of these massive fortified places. You can keep people out if you want to. It's very hard to make your way into these very heavily guarded, very heavily fortified spaces. And that's what's happening to Electra, really. You know, she has been sort of closed out of the fortified world by her family, by Clytemnestra, and she's out in this very arid plain of the Argolid region, where it's much more difficult to survive, really. So it's, the natural geography really does set up this contrast of circumstance quite nicely. You can see how the geography plays with some of these ideas that Euripides explores a little bit throughout the play.
Thank you. Yeah, that's super interesting. And I think in the play and lots of Electra speeches, there's this real sense of kind of desertedness, a sense of loss, and a sense of kind of emptiness. She speaks about how she can't sing at the festivals and dance with all the other people and things. And so I think it's really interesting to kind of imagine her in quite a sort of desolate, barren space. And that would really help the audience, I think, envision that emotional turmoil that she goes through. And just a question that's not one we've prepared, but just to lead on from that, I think it's maybe interesting to think about how that space of these archaic Greek settlements contrasts with the theatre space of classical Athens, and where the audience will be experiencing this tragedy. So yeah, I wonder if you had any thoughts about that contrast, maybe? Yeah,
so it's interesting, isn't it? Because the theatre is a space that is almost enclosed, and it can feel quite claustrophobic, kind of sat shoulder to shoulder next to all that audience. And yet the idea that Euripides wants the audience to have is of this wide, open, arid space. What he can get us thinking about a little bit as well, of course, is standing outside gates and outside walls and buildings. There would have been rather fantastic gates into the city of Argos. We know that there were gates, but they haven't been attested completely archaeologically. And gates are a very interesting thing that playwrights can play with, of course. When people come onto and go off stage, the playwright can make us think about people going into a city, going out of a city, going into something like a large house or a palace or something. Yes, we have all these spaces playing, haven't we? We've got the claustrophobic space of the theatre. We've got that, albeit quite small, orchestra at the front that has to be, representative of a whole much greater Argolid plain. And then we've got something built up behind us, which maybe that's a house, maybe that's, representative of the whole city behind. All those spaces playing together.
Yeah, actually, I found that the journey of that answer kind of leads quite nicely onto this, which is this idea of like how we recreate those sets and these planes. And for our production set, we decided to create a naturalistic looking environment, and with set and costumes and props. And we were wondering how the scenery and costumes would have been to Euripides' audience if it would have been something naturalistic, if maybe all of those geographical features would have been really accentuated, and how sort of faithfully they would have been portrayed.
Well, I think for a modern production, one of the challenges is the real difference in playing space. So something that I think links very nicely to what Michael was saying about the space of the theatre is thinking about the open sky, and thinking about how you have that advantage when you're trying to conjure up this idea of a natural environment in space, that actually as an audience you're sitting underneath the open sky. And that moment when in so many of the tragedies there's reference to the mountains, or there's reference to the natural landscape around, and it's a backdrop, it's right there. And it is one of the things that struck me when I first visited Epidavros and sat, and it's an extraordinary experience. And it changes how I think you perceive the world that's being conjured in the drama. Having said that, of course, one of the things that tragedy does is play with the present and the past. So I've always found Sauvignon Inwood's notion of zooming and distancing very, very helpful. So the idea that at some moments when you're watching this play as a Euripidean audience, you're thinking, this is the methodological pass, this is safely at a distance. And at other moments, it's right up in your contemporary present. And while, you know, that's been explored through language and scholarship, I think another really important element in how that works as a process is through the scenery, is through the costume as well. And we've got a really neat example of this from the Pronomos vase, which is this spectacular crater wine mixing vessel that survives and is now in Naples. And it shows us a cast from a play at, you know, dare I say, an after show party. And they are still in costume. And one of them is dressed as Heracles. And the breastplate he has is a contemporary piece of armor for the Euripidean audience, or whoever the audience was. We don't know what the play was. But it tells us that even a mythological hero can have elements which for us would be anachronistic if you were thinking in terms of period drama, that bring it very close to home for the audience. So I think there is a bit of a play in how the audience experiences what it looks like. And, you know, the costumes are elaborate, the costumes are very different from everyday dress. If we want to think of, you know, in terms of what people are wearing around Athens in the 5th century, it's deliberately, you know, on another level, but that's not to say there aren't elements that can bring it right into the contemporary present. And I think that is something that is really, really challenging. I'm sure you found this when you were making your decisions. You know, do you want to replicate that experience? How do you replicate it if you choose to go down that path of trying to bring in some of the contemporary while also allowing for the distance?
That's such an interesting point, just because something that struck me about Electra and reading it, and one of the main decisions that I had for staging it, was how it reflects the audience almost by being kind of downgraded into this unroyal setting. And I think so many conversations that I had with Zoe were about making the costumes reflect that and be a bridge that the audience can connect with by recognizing themselves on stage.
Oh, wonderful. Yeah, I love that idea of a bridge. I think that's exactly it, exactly right. And you know, as you were saying, that idea of identity between the main players in this play and the audience, because we're all outsiders in the Electra.
And that leads on really nicely to our next question, actually, because something we've really had a chance to play around with is colour. And we've used this to create an element that's slightly less naturalistic, because we've sort of created a visual language through the use of the colour red that either contrasts or group together certain characters. And we know that colour was very important in ancient statuary. And I was just wondering, what about in ancient theatre? How important was colour for costumes, but also for the tragic texts in general?
I mean, I'll give a sort of half answer in that from an archaeological and material perspective, colour is such a difficult thing to try and find in the record. And I guess that's just because so many of the things that would have been colourful, like these wonderful textiles that, you know, you can deal with in your production now, they don't really survive to us. I mean, to get organic material surviving, you need it to be preserved in either a very sort of waterlogged, swampy environment or somewhere very, very arid, like out in a desert. So the conditions, the environmental conditions within Greece aren't particularly good for preserving some of those fantastic costumes that we know that some of the actors must have been wearing. And we do know that there must have been absolutely fantastic, vibrant colours that people were wearing. There are all sorts of references in texts to, you know, people coming on talking about, you know, dyed costumes or, you know, bits highlighted with gold or gold diadems or whatever. And but you know, tying that to actual pieces of evidence that we can point at is much harder. I mean, another data set that Rosie has already talked about a little bit is pot painting. Pot painting can tell us little bits about what people were wearing, but in some ways that's just a very tantalizing glimpse, because as you know, our record of pot painting is predominantly black figure or red figure, and by the nature of that technique, the pictures that are on those pots are going to be quite monochrome. I mean, occasionally you get little bits of costumes kind of picked out with a little bit of color, but that's only going to be a little footprint of the fantastic vibrant colors that people were once wearing. I don't know, Rosie, do you want to add to that?
I'd love to jump in with my very favorite pieces of or sort of body of evidence from the ancient world, which blew my mind the first time I discovered these things, which is the white ground lekythoi vases, which obviously they don't show theatre costume per se, but they do give a glimpse of the sorts of colours. You know, all of a sudden it's like this switch, and it brings the ancient world to life. So that they're you know, again, the survival, the way in which they the state of preservation means you can't get all of the color that you want to, but it gives you enough to go on and start to fill out the color, so that you're not imagining everything in terracotta and black, so that you're not thinking of it in terms of white drapery all over the place. And as you were saying, I mean, we do get all those pointers in the text to just how important color is. And I was really interested to hear Zoe, you saying about creating this language, this visual language, which is absolutely what we can see the ancient playwrights were doing, and this code, which then of course the audience get to decode. This is the process of tragedy. Sometimes that's explicitly marked in the text with a character saying, but why are you dressed in this dark clothing? You know, what, why mourning when you're outside a temple, etc. And so, you know, it really allows the ancient audience to reflect on their own viewing and their own way of, and once you're in the theatre, that contract of viewing where you understand that something is being communicated and you're sitting there and thinking, okay, this colour is being used, what am I given to understand? And one of my favorite examples, I suppose, and of course it's very, very famous example of the way in which colour can be exploited in these plays is in the Oresteia, with the purple cloth that gets laid down for Agamemnon to walk across as he goes into the palace to his death. And the number of the layers of symbolism to that one prop, just extraordinary. I mean, on a very basic level, visually, you're getting this pool of blood because of the nature of dyes, where this is sort of a reddy purple spread across that playing space. But it works on so many other levels as well, because of the network of verbal references that have built up the symbolism, which goes hand in hand with what you're seeing visually. And it's very deliberate in the Electra as well, isn't it? The way in which you've got this contrast between Electra posturing with, look at these rags that I have, I've got nothing to wear to the festival. Even when the chorus offer her something to wear, she still doesn't want to have the finery, because it's a position, isn't it? And by contrast, we have Clytemnestra very much aligned with the barbarian, and the references to her finery, which I think we have to take as, you know, finery, cosmos, is something which is expensive by virtue of the dyes that are used, by virtue of the elaborateness of the weaving. So, I mean, I've always taken this to mean that, yeah, Clyde, and you know, of course, there's that comment, isn't there? Let me, when Electra says, let me watch that you don't get any muck on your fine clothing. And I have taken that to mean, when I picture this in my head, that you've got her there in this very colourful clothing, as this statement of wealth versus there's Electra sort of indulging in her poverty, almost wanting us to realise just how poorly she's been treated. So it can, it plays such an important part, I think, overall in understanding how the dramaturgy works in these plays.
That's an amazing answer. Thank you so much. I think it's definitely giving some more ideas as well from a design perspective, I think. And I think something else that I've definitely read about is also the importance perhaps of patterning as well as colour, and the patterns that were obviously woven into the fabrics. And I think that can create a very interesting contrast, especially in Electra when she's in these very, very plain rags. So yeah, and I think that does lead on very nicely to the next question, because we were thinking about the question of spectacle, and this really strong visual image of tragedy. So and the chorus were often the most spectacular part of the plays, with their singing and their dancing, and we were wondering how important the specific props and costumes of the chorus were to adding to this sense of spectacle.
Okay. I mean, I'll be quite brief on this one, because I think actually you're on much better ground in comedy for these really elaborate, wonderful costumes for the chorus. But having said that, I do think there's something about this, thinking about a group of 12 to 15, depending when we're talking about, people all dressed, maybe not precisely identically. I mean, I think there's, judging from VAR's evidence, some variety between the costumes for the chorus, or the potential for it. But if you imagine going back to that example of having an entire chorus in Euripides' Suppliant Women, for example, dressed in black, and just what it looks like when you have that group of people all together. And it's a helpful example because it's got the same connotations for us, that you would know at a glance that there's a group of people experiencing grief, mourning. But in terms of visual spectacle, I think that's very striking in this space, especially when you have a character who is, by contrast, turning up with maybe a wreath on their head in celebration, garlanded for a festival. And then you have this, and it becomes almost not quite an obstacle, but it becomes something you have to contend with, both for the characters within the play, but also for the audience as well. You can't unthink it, you can't undo it. And that idea of repetition, I think, in visual reinforcement, if they're all standing there and they've got a libation urn, if they're all standing there and they've got suppliant branches. I mean, suppliant branches are a good example where you've got a prop which absolutely is reinforced across your chorus, but also it demonstrates the magnitude of the problem for the person who is being called upon to do something about this. Thinking about Aeschylus's Suppliant Women is a really good example of the pressure put on the king when they're there and they've got these suppliant branches, and you can't, you've got to do something about it. Eventually in that play they step forward, they place them down, etc. But I think it is spectacular just by virtue of being repeated, actually, and by the sort of mass that it takes in terms of the visual landscape within the play.
So you were talking about the chorus, with their branches in the Suppliant Women, and in our production we've been having, the chorus have been, manipulating the set and helping to sort of create the world of the play, and and at certain points becoming sort of part of the fabric of that world. How does that relate to the sort of ancient context? How is this similar or different to the kind of role that the chorus would have played on the ancient stage?
If I can jump in with a tangential but interesting point, a tangential but interesting recent archaeological discovery, and then we can get back to the chorus afterwards. There's a fantastic new piece of evidence that's emerged in recent excavations over the past few years about this issue that you're talking about the physicality of changing location and about creating spectacle on stage. And it comes from an excavation also in the Peloponnese, but a bit further to the southwest in the region of Mycenae, from the site of Thoria. So since 2016, Zeni Arapiani has been directing an excavation at the site of ancient Thoria for the Archaeological Society in Athens, and part of that excavation has been of a theatre that has been dated to around the 4th or 3rd centuries BC, subsequently abandoned, and then interestingly, right in the centre of the theatre, a building got placed there afterwards, and it seems to have been some kind of 2-story processing workshop. But the thing that's very interesting for this issue of scenery and of how you change visuals for your audience is that in the excavation of the Skinotheki, so of the staging building at the back, this small channel has been found, which looks like a sort of wheeled channel, a similar thing which has been found at the theatre at Mycenae, so a few kilometers away, also in Messenia. But you know, on finding this, the excavators are talking about you know, this idea of having these wonderful painted skinies that we often think about, and actually being able to see in front of them, you know, the way that these might have been wheeled in or out, so that, you know, all of a sudden the audience can see one set of images behind the actors, and then, you know, that gets rolled away and then they see something entirely different. I mean, who was doing that rolling? Not entirely sure, but maybe, you know, as in the case of what you're creating here, the chorus may have had a role to play in you know, changing the dynamic, changing the scene that the audience see there.
That's fabulous. Oh, that's really exciting.
It's a really cool find.
That's great.
And it does raise that question. I'm glad you said that about who's doing it, because there's always this notion of stagehands. And you really think, well, look, there's an entire chorus here, and it raises that whole question of how much you can sort of fill in for yourself. Because I'm sure when you've been working with the text, thinking about the production, you know, you have to fill the gap. You have to understand that it's not obviously all there with stage directions or anything. So we're on safe ground if we're thinking about marked moments in the text where, you know, it says, let's walk forward and put our bows down, or, you know, where we actually know something is taking place. But I'm sure there must have been so many more actions that are unmarked in the text that survived. I mean, but let's put that to one side, because I can't prove anything with that. What I wanted to add on, if I may, on this is the idea of conjuring up in the mind's eye of the audience. So transforming the space through visual imagery, and especially in choruses. In this, I was thinking about that chorode in Electra about Achilles going to Troy, and it's delightful with this reference to the sea nymphs and the waves and the dolphins, and, you know, you can absolutely picture it. And for that moment, as I say, in the mind's eye at least, that is how we're seeing the space. You know, it becomes a seascape with you know, whatever dancing the chorus did while they were singing about that. And it's not, of course, precisely the same as what you were talking about in terms of the chorus going and actually physically changing it. But what I think you've done is produced a very neat sort of translation of the role of the chorus, because, you know, they're absolutely doing that, transforming the space, becoming part of the space. I think that's really part of what they're doing in the ancient productions as well, even if they may have been doing it in a less physical way.
So interesting, because I think, as someone who's been designing things for this production, I suppose it's kind of a sort of non-historical approach, but I think that the words speak so visually to me, imagining things. So it's almost hard not to imagine things like the messenger speech and want to do something visual with that, just because it's so rich. And I think even if a modern audience, I don't think that it's necessarily that I would think a modern audience would need it. It's more that I think it's like almost a way of kind of giving something more to the text and kind of giving playing with it the most as you creatively can, and I just think there's so much exciting opportunities there, which does link quite nicely to the next question, in the sense of obviously modern productions have really gone in all sorts of different directions, and I think that's something really exciting for designers working on tragedy, is that kind of blank space in a way, because of that historical distance, that they can interpret things in however they see fit. And I was just wondering, of all the modern productions that you guys have seen, do you think that there are a few, or in particular, where the costumes and set have really stood out as a way to convey the essence of the tragedy, and how did they do this?
So a production I saw this last summer, actually, I want to talk about, which was staged as part of the Athens Epidavros festival, and it was Yanis Kakleas's interpretation of Euripides' Orestes, and this was staged in the theatre of ancient Epidavros. So going back to what we were saying earlier about space and locality, that was a very interesting production to be seeing at Epidavros, because that's in the Argolid region. It's just a few kilometers away from all of these key places that are mentioned in the text about these key places where the drama is happening. So what this production looked like was in some ways similar to what you're doing. The director had gone for a sort of naturalistic vibe. The orchestra area was covered over in sort of soil and grasses, and the whole area felt very sort of rough and primeval, really. It looked just like the landscape of the Argolid. You know, if you stepped outside the theatre and you walked around, you would see that. The chorus were all dressed in rather smart black or dark evening wear, a bit like what you're doing with coloured, sort of, you know, unite certain parts of the company together. They were all coded together in one colour, whereas Orestes and Electra, they were in sort of light cottony white fabrics, but they were also quite dirty, worn fabrics. You know, it looked like they'd been living in this outside world. And at one stage, you know, they were pulling on what looked like animal skins and everything. There was meant to be this contrast between the outdoorsy world that they were in versus, you know, the rather smart, guarded inside world that, Clytemnestra was still part of. But the one thing to do with costume and set that you know really it stood out for me was that okay, this was an outdoorsy world, but it was meant to look, I almost thought, you know, post-apocalyptic as well. There was furniture everywhere. You know, there was a chair knocked over there and a table knocked over there, and it made sense, okay, as you walked into the theatre and you thought about the moment that Euripides is talking about, the moment within that story, having that sort of chaos spread throughout the landscape makes sense. But then towards the end of the production, in one of the final choral songs, when the chorus are talking about the descendants of Tantalus and the halls of Atreus, and there are references made to the feast of Atreus, the chorus started working the set around. They pulled up this table that had been overturned. They put all the chairs around that had just been sort of lying as part of the scenery. And then a large bit of fabric, a large bit of blood-stained fabric Orestes had sort of been wearing almost like a cloak in certain parts of the play. That got spread on top of the table as a dining cloth. And just the whole image made sense all of a sudden, that, you know, here the chorus were talking about the Feast of Atreus and you could see it there in front of you. So I thought that was a really, really interesting creation. I mean, it was a beautiful moment to watch. It was one of those sort of spine-tinglingly beautiful, really striking images to see. But, you know, the set in itself made sense from the moment that you walked in and saw it, but then it made even more sense by the end. So I thought that was a really beautiful manipulation of both costume and scenery there. And I'm sure that's an image that, well, it has stayed with me and it will stay with me for quite a while.
Well, I have an example. In fact, it's a production that I've only seen a recording of, but even the recording is so visually stunning. I can only imagine that actually, you know, to have gone to see it, it toured in the 80s and 90s. It must have been really something. So this is Nina Gower's Medea, where its use of costume made absolute sense to me in terms of Medea's, in terms of Euripides' text, even though you know, it uses traditions from Japanese theatre like kabuki, and I'm no expert at all. And yet, one of the things that was so striking about watching this was you understood what was being expressed, you know, without knowing all the conventions and the traditions. So there's a moment, for example, where both the chorus and Medea have this red ribbon that they're pulling out of their mouth and is spewing out like this, and it's like this blood spewing out. And you know, if you read the scholarship on it to understand the conventions and the inversion of the tradition, this is usually the ribbon would be taken and put into the mouth as a sort of love gesture, and so this is absolutely the repudiation of Jason and everything that goes with it. But also there was just something on another level with that was so powerful visually, and that seemed to me to express absolutely some of the ideas running through Euripides' Medea, you know, where you have the idea of the river running up the hill and everything being turned on its head. And so, you know, that was one example. The way in which, and so it's an all-male cast, but again, you know, by exploiting these conventions, you can really play with the idea of traditional gender, trappings of gender, and Medea ends up, you know, it starts off, you know, spectacular with this ginormous costume made of antique obies, you know, the sash that goes around, kimonos that have been sewn together and make this fantastical brocade outer layer, which by the end has been stripped off. She disrobes and it's just her. You know, right at the end of it, where she, if we like, you know, in our terms, you might say, you know, when she shows her true colours at the end, when she's actually speaking metaphorically without a mask, and is absolutely herself, and says, "This is what I've done." It was so powerful, and I always go back to it because I'd never seen anything quite like it. And even though it was obviously in some ways a million miles from the ancient production and the way the ancient production would have worked, in other respects it felt absolutely aligned to it, and it made very clear to me that translation, if we want to talk in those terms, of an ancient production, making it work on a modern stage, absolutely isn't about replication. And I'm so heartened to hear about the way in which you've been working with your concepts and working with, you know, that you're really thinking about how you want that to come across and communicate what's in communicate the text without being sort of bound by archaeology.
Well, this has been a wonderful, wonderful discussion, and it always strikes me the way in which, especially in recent years, material culture has really made it, has really changed the way that we think of Greek tragedy, we think of Greek theatre as a whole, and I think in a very positive way. And has given us this whole new world that, is not just text, but it's so much more than just text. Rosie and Michael, thank you so much again for joining us today, and thank you for these wonderful questions, Zoe, and Zoe and Lucy. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. It sounds like it's going to be a wonderful production.
We hope so. Thank you.